Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for another edition of IRENA Insights webinar series. My name is Martina Lyons and I'm from the IRENA Innovation and Technology Center in Bonn. Most of you know who IRENA is, but let me make a quick introduction of who we are. We are an intergovernmental organization with currently 162 member countries and 21 countries in accession. We support countries in their transition to a sustainable energy future and serve as the principal platform for international cooperation, a center of excellence, a repository of policy, technology, resource, and financial knowledge on renewable energy. Our analytical work and our engagement with our members generate a lot of valuable insights, and we are constantly looking for more ways to share those insights with you. And that's what brings us to our IRENA Insights webinar program, where we share with you key findings from our latest work, offer you insights into opportunities, trends, best practices, but also innovative solutions to address various challenges. A small caveat, we aim to keep these webinars short, circa 30 minutes. So we cannot cover everything, but we do hope to give you enough to decide whether to delve deeper into the topic. And we signpost in our presentation further sources of more in-depth information to help you to do that. About today's webinar, so it is titled Socio-economic Benefits of Renewables Job Creation. So the energy transition can go hand in hand with a range of socio-economic benefits if supported by ambitious policies. One of these benefits is job creation, which is a critical objective for people and policymakers in countries around the world. Today's webinar will present the IRENA's recently released 2020 edition of Renewable Energy and Jobs, the annual review, which is the 7th report in the series. It provides updated findings from earlier editions, offering estimates for renewable energy employment around the world in 2019. During today's webinar, we will highlight trends for major renewable energy technologies such as wind, solar, PV, hydropower, or biomass, offer insights for selected countries, and relate these various factors that influence employment generation, including policy initiatives and market dynamics. Today's presenter is Mr. Michael Renner, who is IRENA expert on socioeconomics of the energy transition. His presentation will last approximately 20 minutes to allow another 10 minutes for your questions. But before I hand over the microphone to Michael, I have a few housekeeping items to cover. Next slide, please. Today's webinar is, as usually, recorded and will be available together with the presentation slides on IRENA webinar website under the past webinars. The previous webinar recording and slides are already there, and we invite you to visit them. And we will share again the link to those in the follow-up email. You can also download the presentation from the handout section. Can we please move to another slide? All of you are currently muted and will remain so throughout the webinar. We would love to hear from you during today's webinar presentation. So if you have any question to our speaker, please send it to us through the question feature that you can find on the webinar panel. We will be monitoring questions throughout the session and select some to be answered by our speaker. Due to time constraints, we apologize in advance if your question is not answered. Can we move to another slide, please? May I ask you to move to another slide? Also, please use the chat feature if you want to introduce yourself to other participants. To be able to reflect on the delivery of our webinars and way to improve it, and also what else you would like us to cover in the future editions, we would appreciate your feedback. At the end of the webinar, and then again in our follow-up email, we will share with you a very short satisfactory survey, which we invite you to complete. We are monitoring your comments and we work on selecting topics of your interest and trying to shift times of webinars to accommodate various time zones. If you experience any technical difficulties, please try to reconnect by dialing in via phone. You can get the number by clicking on the phone option located on the webinar panel. Otherwise, please visit support service on the GoToWebinar website. And without any further ado, let me kick things off by welcoming Michael. Michael, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Martina, and hello to everybody on this webinar. Thank you very much for your interest. So Martina, as you were saying, job creation is a critical objective, I think, for both decision makers and the general public alike, and I think for very obvious reasons, and has been a critical objective for a long time. But I think this is now especially the case because of a number of circumstances, right? As countries undertake the needed energy transition, as they try to fulfill the Sustainable Development Agenda, move toward greater climate compatibility in terms of how the economies are shaped, and then, of course, now also coping with the COVID-19 pandemic. So there are a number of reasons that really reinforce the importance of jobs and job creation. So at IRENA, we argue that supported by ambitious policies, the energy transition can actually go hand in hand with job creation and with other socioeconomic benefits. If you can please move to the next slide. And I can actually not see the advancing slide, I don't think, but I assume that it's showing for everybody. So for almost a decade, we have examined job creation in renewable energy worldwide. The findings are published in our report series called Renewable Energy and Jobs Annual Review. The latest edition of it was completed just in September, and I'm going to present some highlights from the report. Now, as the slide indicates, the annual review is part of a broader series of IRENA reports that we do on the socioeconomics of the energy transition. So the slideshow's report covers from these different work streams. So we publish, for one, a series on what we call leveraging local capacities. And these reports examine opportunities for countries to create domestic value, and we look at materials and labor requirements for the different renewable energy technologies. We have so far analyzed the solar PV industry. We have looked at onshore and offshore wind, and we are readying for release over the next year a report on solar water heaters, one on concentrating solar power, and one on small hydro. We have also a series of reports on the gender dimension. Back in early 2019, we published an overarching report on this topic and then followed it with an analysis of the wind industry this year. We are planning to then do a next report on solar photovoltaics in 2021. Finally, at the bottom of the slide, you can see we have a series of reports that were started in 2015 based on econometric modeling of IRENA's energy transition scenarios looking out to 2030 and 2050. In these reports, we analyzed what the transition means in terms of GDP, human welfare benefits, and employment. Next slide, please. So let me go into the jobs report next, and you can sort of see a bit of a summary of what this report entails, and you can all actually find it online and download it for free if you're interested. So this latest edition of the jobs report analyzes employment for the year 2019. We try in each edition to continue to close data gaps, which still exist most definitely, and we refine the underlying methodologies that we apply. Now, this particular edition highlights the latest employment trends by renewable energy technology. It offers information on leading countries and selected others. It points to the need for better information, not just on job quantity, but also job quality. We do include some findings from our gender work, and we have a feature that looks at the issue of education and skills training, which is really rising in importance. So we are actually hoping that in the IRENA Insight webinar series that we will do future webinars on these topics on gender and on skills and training. So stay peeled for those. Next slide, please. So you can see in the next slide the findings from our reports. We estimate that last year at least 11.5 million people held jobs in renewable energy worldwide. You can see that this number has grown from about 7.3 million in 2012. And it's quite clear that some technologies are more dynamic, faster growing than others. Just as a quick note, you can see that hydropower is shown separately. And the reason for that is that the methodology that we use for hydropower really allows us only to provide estimates for direct jobs, whereas for the other technologies, we are covering both direct and indirect employment. Next slide, please. So this next slide shows the individual technologies in the renewable energy firmament. So it's quite clear that solar photovoltaics, solar PV retains the top spot with about 3.8 million jobs last year. And this is about a third of the total renewable energy workforce worldwide. Other leading industries in the sector are liquid biofuels, hydropower, wind, and followed by solar heating and cooling and solid biomass. Let me just mention briefly, decentralized renewables, in particular solar technologies, help to improve energy access where people really lack that. The problem, I think, is, and this shows up in our report as well to a large extent, is that available statistics really do not yet capture well this particular dimension. It also remains difficult to really get a good handle on the jobs and the livelihoods that are enabled by the productive uses of energy in local communities. But we have made a start in this current edition, and we hope to further expand the information on this very important dimension in coming editions. Next slide, please. So it's worth noting, and this slide shows it quite clearly, that a small number of countries, China, Brazil, India, the United States, and the members of the European Union, remain very prominent in renewable energy jobs worldwide. And in a sense, this is not really very surprising, right? In the first place, these countries or these regions account for a very large share of the world's population. But more to the point, they are major installation markets, and many of them play a significant role in the manufacturing of equipment for renewable energy projects. So this is, I think, a central feature that will not change very rapidly. But that said, more and more countries are actually able to derive benefit from renewable energy. Can we please move to the next slide? When we look at several individual renewable energy technologies, we can see a high degree of concentration there as well. This slide shows the 10 leading countries for jobs in solar PV, in wind, and in biofuels. And together they account for between 85 and 90% of all jobs in these sectors. So it's a very high degree of concentration that we see. China in particular plays a dominant role especially in solar PV, but also in wind. Brazil remains by far the largest biofuels employer. There, and in countries like Colombia, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, and some others, many of the livelihoods are found in the labor-intensive agricultural supply chain. If you compare that with Europe and North America, for example, they have far more industrialized operations in the biofuels industry, so they require far fewer people. In onshore and offshore wind, a number of European countries are strong, both in terms of domestic installations, but also in serving export markets. Next slide, please. So this slide just very briefly indicates that in addition to these leading countries, there are, of course, other countries that benefit more and more from renewable energy job creation as well. And this is really just to give you a sense of what the report covers in terms of additional countries. This is particularly the case with regard to solar PV, where a number of Southeast Asian countries are figuring as very important manufacturers and exporters. But so you really get a sense that various regions of the world, including the Asia Pacific area, Latin America, Caribbean, and parts of Africa, are also now more and more benefiting from job creation. Next slide, please. So now let me talk a little bit about the various factors that shape and influence employment creation. In the first place, there are, of course, maturing technologies and reduced costs, which make renewables more cost competitive with fossil fuels. And that should really help to create more and more employment as renewables are much more cheaply installed and used. So new installations create employment in project development, in manufacturing, in sales, and in construction and installation. Cumulative installations ultimately translate into employment in operations and maintenance. What's really important is raising the policy ambition to drive forward this process of installing, deploying renewables. So deployment policies are essential. What's also very important is so-called integrating policies that help to provide a predictable role for variable renewable energy technologies in power generation and in various end uses, and to just overall improve the system flexibility as this transition, as this change in the energy sector takes place. Let me briefly mention labor productivity, of course, is a factor of rising importance. So the number of workers needed for a given task changes over time. And there's a number of reasons for that, right? I mean, one is growing automation in the manufacturing of equipment. We see rising uses of artificial intelligence. There are rising economies of scale. And it's just overall, of course, a learning process that takes place where you realize how you can do things much more readily and more quickly and more easily, and you end up probably needing fewer people for the same tasks over time. Now, the ability of individual countries to create jobs depends on the structures of their economies and their domestic capabilities. So some countries are very important manufacturers of renewable energy equipment, and they may also serve as very important exporters for other countries. Countries that do not produce equipment create jobs mostly in the construction and installation segment, and this is of course something that requires more local labor inputs than anything that might be derived from abroad. The depth and capability of domestic supply chains then translates into different degrees of reliance on imports of equipment and other inputs. And we really see the renewable energy industry, having a particular geographic footprint and particular trade patterns that, sometimes really sort of reinforce these existing patterns. Although some countries have been able to really become much stronger actors by dint of very strong domestic policies. Some of them have used strong local content requirements. Others have not really relied on these policies. So you see a variety of approaches and a variety of outcomes. Next slide, please. So at IRENA, we strongly believe that what we need is a strong, comprehensive set of policies to ensure an ambitious expansion of renewable energy deployment, and also to maximize the benefits that we can derive in terms of socioeconomics from this process. So this slide shows this by way of 3 interlocking policy gears. This includes what I just mentioned very briefly, the deployment and integration policies, but also a set of enabling, or what we often call just transition policies. These policies really, and this is the point of these interlocking gears, they need to complement and reinforce each other. Next slide, please. So this slide sort of contextualizes this a little bit in terms of the various structural aspects that need to be addressed for the most beneficial outcomes. If you look on the left side of the slide, you can see again these two of these 3 gears, gear symbols that represent deployment and integrating policies. And clearly ambition is a key driver in this. But it's clear that countries need to confront a number of what we call structural realities that may make it difficult for countries to derive the full benefit from the energy transition. So if you look, for example, at the fact that a number of countries continue to have a very strong structural dependence on fossil fuels, their supply chain structures may lack necessary depth and strength. There are various kinds of trade and technology-related dependencies. In addition to those, there are likely misalignments between the new jobs that emerge in the energy transition and older jobs in fossil fuels that are falling by the wayside. And these, vary in terms of, spatial differences, temporal differences. We look at different sectors of the economy. We look at different occupational patterns that come into play. So there are various differences in terms of how well the old and the new jobs are actually, either falling by the wayside or being created in one or the other area in the world. So this is really why ultimately we need a set of enabling and just transition policies. They can help in assisting in localizing parts of the supply chain. We are thinking, for example, in terms of industrial policies, and these include things like access to credit and land, support for business incubation, programs to develop and upgrade supplier capacities, potentially the formation of regional industrial clusters. We are looking at the education and skills training strategies to ensure that a capable workforce comes into its own, and that ultimately that really skills demand and supply are reasonably well in balance with each other. And of course, all of this needs to go hand in hand with various fiscal and financial policies, which could include incentives, investment credits, subsidies, and grants. And I think much of it, of course, depends in terms of mobilizing private capital, but we also strongly believe that we need to be very clear about public investment strategies to guide along this very challenging and this very, very complicated energy transition process. So we need to, this is the final point in terms of the different kinds of policies, we need to address the various labor misalignments and smooth out the overall process as it unfolds. So this involves various active labor market measures. It involves a range of social protection programs in the interim. And these, I think, are issues that are becoming much more important, really, as we move along. Next and final slide, please. So the need for holistic thinking in all of this, I think, has been dramatically reinforced by the COVID-19 crisis. It really should further, I mean, in addition to the factors that we already have had in place, it further should prompt us to continuously rethink how our economies work and really to make sure that they work for everybody concerned. I think the question, what is the economy for, is an important one to ask as we move along in this transformative process. So assuming that ambitious and comprehensive policies are more and more being put in place, our transition scenarios and the econometric modeling work that we undertake suggest that a transition pathway in accord with the Paris Climate Agreement could create far greater numbers of jobs than we currently have. So according to our Global Renewables Outlook, a report we published in April of this year, today's 11.5 million renewable energy jobs could grow to almost 30 million a decade from now, and perhaps 42 million by the year 2050. And you can see in the slide that together with other energy transition technologies, such as energy efficiency measures, these numbers could rise from about 28 million today to about 71 million in 2030 and 78 million by 2050. So I think an ambitious transition pathway really holds tremendous benefit. But I think we need to just be very clear that the accompanying policies are really very central in this. This process does not unfold on its own. We need to really drive it forward with very strong and clear-eyed policies. So this concludes my presentation, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Michael, for a very thorough and insightful presentation on renewable energy sector employment, both direct and indirect, in the last year and also projections in the future. The numbers and trends are striking, but without any delays, let me go directly to the questions we have received from the audience. Please use question feature if you have questions for Michael. Thank you all for posting them. So let me start with this one. What are the types of econometric models that you are using to develop this report?
That's a question that I'm not very well placed to answer because I'm actually not part of the modeling team that we use. We have a long-term consultant working with us, and we use the Cambridge Econometrics group in the UK to actually do the nitty-gritty numbers crunching, well, the modeling and the numbers crunching for us. So what I would suggest actually is the question, or what you may want to do is actually look at our Global Renewables Outlook, which really provides more detail on the results of the modeling work and provides a little bit of detail on the model that's being used for our purposes.
Thank you, Michael. Another one. Can you please state at which position in the value chain the most jobs in solar PV are to be found? Thank you.
I mean, for most countries, this is really in the installation segment, right? Because when you look at the manufacturing of equipment or of components, it's really highly concentrated in a fairly small number of countries. I mean, China being super prominent, and I think I mentioned briefly a number of Southeast Asian and also East Asian countries play an important but not quite as important role as China. So it's really regionally quite concentrated on the manufacturing side. So for most countries in the world, really the installation side is much more prominent. But there, I think what we need to look at is really how does this continue to evolve, this picture, because as I mentioned, we are seeing very strong automating trends in not just manufacturing, but also in some of the operations and maintenance segments of the supply chain. So it's not a very static picture at all, quite the contrary.
Thank you very much. Another question is a question whether we do have any quantitative analyses on the parallel job losses in the fossil energy sector over time, the net job effect on energy transition toward renewable energy, in general sustainable energy, and not only related to power plants, but also to mining, for example.
Right. I mean, this is, of course, a very important question. Now, of course, our principal remit as IRENA, right, as our name suggests, is, of course, to look at the renewable energy side of the energy sector. That said, we are, of course, very aware that we cannot just look at what takes place in the renewable energy sector alone and say, well, the rest of us is of no concern to us. So we know that we already actually see employment loss in the oil and gas sector, in the coal sector. Most of this in the years past really has been due to particular dynamics within these industries. We more and more in more recent years have seen, of course, we see the beginnings of this energy transition process playing out, so that we are seeing less and less in the way of new job creation in these fossil fuel sectors and more in the renewable field. But I think what's really important is to realize that the coal-dependent regions of the world, and I think practically every region of the world has these, are ones that we cannot neglect. We need to, and this is really goes back to what I was saying about the need for enabling or just transition policies. We need to be very clear that while the overall job numbers or the job balance between the renewables and fossil fuels looks good, right? We fully expect that the new numbers in renewables will far outnumber those being lost in coal and in oil and gas. That alone is really cold comfort for individuals who will lose their jobs, right? So we need to do everything we can in a number of regards. Well, one is, to what extent can we actually reorient and repurpose the skills that people have in these older sectors? We talk quite a bit actually about the parallels between, for example, offshore oil and gas and offshore wind, where there are similar types of skills to some extent that I think can be where the old skills can be brought to bear on the new industries. But I think it's quite clear that many, for example, in coal mining, may not really have the opportunity to take up a job, say, in solar PV or in wind or other renewables. And I think we need to be very clear-eyed about this. So we shouldn't expect difficult things, to happen, but rather we should do all we can. And this is really addressed to ultimately the governments or governmental decision makers. To what extent can we actually ensure that we invest in regional economies to make them as dynamic and as future oriented as we can? Because if that does not take place, of course, an old industry will fall by the wayside, and it will be very difficult for people to find new jobs, right? And I think we know, particularly for coal, I think this is a very strong observation in many places. The regions that have historically had a very strong coal dependency and a strong coal orientation are often regions that are not very well diversified. So I think diversifying these regional economies and local economies is really central. And again, let me be very clear. I think we cannot expect this to play out in a very, very short amount of time. We need to have an understanding that these measures, these transition measures, are playing out over years and perhaps in some ways really over decades, right? So we need to have, I think, this long vision as policymakers to say we need to give support to people in the interim, not just the individuals, to miners and their families, but also to their communities. And say, we are going to give you support in terms of unemployment insurance. We are going to give you support in terms of reskilling, retraining. We may give you support in relocating if a different area is economically more vibrant, more dynamic than the one that you are in. So we need to really make it possible for people to see that they have a stake, a stake in this energy transition future. Because I think we realize by now, if we don't do this, we will really run the risk of running a lot of opposition politically to the energy transition. I mean, this is playing out in a number of countries. And we cannot really, I think, as humanity as a whole, we cannot afford to run that risk of, part of us saying, I have no future in this, therefore I will oppose it. So this is, I'm sorry, this is a bit of a long-winded answer now, but I think there's some very important elements and dimensions that we need to look at very, very seriously.
Indeed, and thank you so much for all the context. And we are running out of time, so let's take two more questions. So the one will be, does the job creation in renewable include also the jobs created in the transport sector, such as EVs?
Well, we don't, in our report, we don't look at that yet, at least. We may do that in the future. I mean, we may look not so much at the vehicles, but we may look at the battery industry, which of course is a very dynamic one. And I think ultimately, I mean, this is what you will see if any of the people in the audience are interested. You can again let me point out the Global Renewables Outlook report, where we talk not only about renewable energy alone, but in context also of the other energy transition technologies, such as energy efficiency, such as electrifying various end-use sectors, including transportation. And so we are more and more, I think, looking at various additional, policy areas and additional opportunities for creating jobs. Again, this particular report now is focused on renewable energy jobs exclusively, but it may not do that forever in the future.
Thank you. And let's close this very interesting session with the last one. What do you see as the necessary skill sets for a job in renewable energy? Do you consider gender aspects?
We very much consider the gender aspects and our finding. I mean, I'm not going to talk much about it because, as mentioned earlier, we hope to do a separate webinar on that very important issue in its own right. But what we do find in the reports that we've done to date is that, well, there's two things. One, there's still an imbalance between the genders, including in the renewable energy sector, right? So there are still more men that are well, I guess in the first place, being attracted to this sector, that have better mentorship opportunities, that have better access to the career networks that are so important to finding jobs. So there is an imbalance, and I think that needs to be corrected. And there are a number of policies that we have pointed to in our reports that can help us accomplish that. But the other side of it, when you compare renewable energy and fossil fuels, we actually look quite good on the renewable energy side. So there are some encouraging aspects, and I think one of them is that I think women, I mean, we've done a survey for one, and many of the respondents in the survey indicated that, renewable energy, of course, I mean, it is a much cleaner industry. It is seen as a much more socially desirable aspect of what you might do with your life in your career. And so I think it attracts women more than what is considered a dirty industry, right? But I think what we need to do is both in terms of making it possible for women to get these jobs and to also stay in them and to advance just as well as a man would. We need to really make sure that in the various mentoring networks in the workplaces that we put in place, or that we ensure that we have policies that are much more equitable than they are to date.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, the time is up. If anyone has more questions, please send them to us at info@irena.org, and we will reply to you by email. Thank you for sending us interesting, relevant questions to choose from, and so much to learn from you, Michael. Thank you very much for sharing all this insight and your experience with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And let me now finish this very interesting webinar with a couple of final announcements. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, we would love to invite you to complete the very short satisfactory survey, which will appear at the end of the webinar, and the link will be shared with you also in the follow-up email. We are monitoring your questions and your comments, and we work on selecting topics of your interest. Thank you in advance for completing the survey, which has been very helpful. And last but not least, we would like to invite you to our next edition of, last slide please, of this webinar series, where we will present you key findings from IRENA's new report, Scenarios for the Energy Transition, Global Experience and Best Practices. The report showcases efforts from governments and technical institutions worldwide to improve the use and development of long-term energy scenarios to guide national policy making towards the clean energy transition. The webinar will also introduce IRENA's Long Energy Scenarios Network, a global platform for energy planners to share their experience and good practices in the use and development of LTES. The network is open to all IRENA member states with established planning processes. The webinar will take place next week on Tuesday, 1st December at 3 p.m. Central European Time. You can register on IRENA website. The link is shared here with you in the presentation, and we will also share with you in the follow-up email. So that is all from us for today. Thank you again. Thank you, Michael, and also all of you for joining us today. Goodbye, and see you soon.